Hello, and welcome to the Bellingham Real Estate Podcast. I'm Paul Balzati. I'm here with Jen Sandoval.
Hi, how's it going?
Welcome, Jen. I'm good.
Good.
So today we are talking about the history of a home is the subject line of the podcast. And we have you on because I know you're a little bit of a history buff, kind of in a way, about the history of homes. And it's a super interesting topic, especially for Bellingham, right? We have a lot of historic homes. So let's get right into it. So Jen, tell us about your background, kind of before real estate. What did you do and all that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, history buff, nerd, I don't know, one of those. But yeah, I've always really been interested in history and architecture. You know, I grew up in Whatcom County and, going to Ferndale, we would go out to Pioneer Park for field trips when I was a kid and see those homes built in like the 1880s, these giant trees, mostly built with like hand saws, axes, and mallets. And to see them still standing is just amazing. And then, I got into construction and worked on a lot of older homes that were built here in the Bellingham core area in that kind of building boom of 1903. And to see how much the styles had changed in that 20 years is just fascinating. And doing contracting and getting really hands-on with a home and kind of figuring out the puzzle of an older home and the different eras of materials and things, I just find really fascinating. And I really get to bring that into real estate. When you're looking at a home online, you can see certain pictures, but then when you're in person, really getting to dive in and look more at the bones of a home and the structure and the systems and how it all works together. I just love. It's fascinating for me.
So how long were you a general contractor?
Yeah, I had a contracting and design company for about 4 years and worked, mostly in the Bellingham core area.
Oh, so you actually did work on older homes too?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
Okay. And then you've now been in real estate for?
About 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into that. You were in contracting. You worked on older homes.
Yes.
You work in the core neighborhoods, which is what we're going to get into more, is the core neighborhoods of Bellingham quite a bit.
I do.
And so you're showing homes that are older. Mm-hmm. What is your process? Because you're one of the only realtors I've ever met who does this, where when you get into an older home, you'll really research the history of it. And I know that can go a lot of directions. So when you look at the history of the home, are you looking at and that's the subject of this podcast, are we talking about the history of like the people that lived there, the history of the additions or remodels? Like what all are you going to look at when you're trying to figure out the history of a house?
Yeah, well,
And how do you do it?
Yeah, I talk a lot with my clients about layers of research, right? So when they are just maybe casually interested in a home, all right, like let's do that first layer of research, which most agents do, right? What's attached? What can we find out? If they're,
attached to the multiple listing service or the county
Mm-hmm.
records or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then, they're more interested in it. Let's take a look. And you can really research a home from two directions, from modern day back and from when it was built forward. And then there's a gap in between that we don't have a lot of data on, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
I like to dig into a home, definitely taking a look at the county assessor's site. On that, my favorite tabs are improvements/buildings, which will tell you when was the effective year built. There's a sketch tab, which can be really helpful when you're also looking at older sketches of the home, because it'll give you a sense, has this footprint been expanded since it was originally built, or were there additions at some point along that way? And then also in the property images tab, there's usually a downloaded image from the 70s or 80s of that home. A lot of crazy things were done in the 90s. So I always like to take a look at that image from the 80s and see, were the windows changed at all? Is there something, when you look at the front of a house and if something's kind of off about it, usually it's because somebody made an alteration.
Right.
Because they were all about proportions when things were built back in the early 1900s, and things were built at like perfect proportions. And so a lot of times alterations that were made since then sometimes make it look off. So if you can look at that image, from the 80s and say, oh, there were two double hung windows up here, and sometime in the 90s, they switched it to a tiny little single slider aluminum. Well, now if you're thinking of replacing that aluminum window, you could go back to the original double hung and the proportions of the house are going to improve hugely.
Yeah. So, and we are talking about in Bellingham, late 1800s, early 1900s, it probably becomes less interesting if the house is maybe 1960 or newer or something like that.
Yeah, but then then the next step I do, which not as many people do, is go to the City IQ mapping system. Okay. So this is a software created by the city. You go on, you look up your address, and you can run a permit counter parcel report for that home. And that's going to tell you any permits or project use plans that were pulled for that property, anything that's attached to that property within the last 30 years or so. Okay. So the furnace was replaced, or maybe they decommissioned an oil system to a furnace. Like, we want to know about that and see how that was done, you know? So that can be really helpful. Also, you can see lots of other data. You can also change the filters on that map to show you which way does the sewer line run to the city main. You know, is it under a garage? And that's going to be a big issue if that comes up as, you know, something that needs to be replaced. So there's lots of data you can get within there. You know, are you sitting on top of the coal mines, which means that you're going to have an extra step if you ever want to do an addition or something like that. So there's lots of info you can get that way.
Where are the coal mines?
The entrances ran along Little Squalicum Boulevard, and so they exist and extend below Columbia neighborhood, Birchwood neighborhood. A decent amount of Bellingham has coal mines.
That's true, because I know the Bellingham Golf and Country Club has some coal mines.
Yep, below. Yeah,
which is good for drainage.
Yeah, but makes your yard a little lumpy.
Yeah. So you're. And I guess you're right. So maybe less interesting if it was built in the 1970s, but not less interesting as far as the history is less interesting, but there still could be really valuable information there in the city in City IQ. Mm-hmm. Do you ever go back if it's like there was a I don't remember the year that I had a Victorian listing, and the sellers had, you know, the original owners, and they owned a store downtown and all this stuff. And, I mean, do you get into that a little bit? That's probably at the last layer, right?
It's an additional layer. It depends how nerdy the buyers are, right? And how much they want to get into it. But you can absolutely, the Polk directories were the main city directories at that time. And you can track kind of who owned the home. The Sanborn fire maps, you can literally go into the library and not check out, but you can use these giant books and see what the house looked like in 1904 and 1913. Those maps also exist online now too. So you can go and look at that property address and see that, in 1904, it was a single story. But now in 1913, it was a story and a half, and it also had a new building garage, right? So you can kind of track what changes were made. And then if you really want to get into it, which I've done on my own personal properties, usually after you buy them and it takes a little bit of time, you can reach out to the Whatcom Museum. And they're really helpful in finding some of that really historical stuff about, you know, who owned the property. Are there any images of it that we can find? Bellingham Herald archives, things like that. So that usually has less to do about buying the house and what we might, you know, want to know about it from a permit perspective or materials perspective, but it's fascinating.
Very cool. So that brings me right into effective year built.
Yes.
So we have a lot of properties in Whatcom County, and Bellingham in particular, that you'll see 1900, effective year built 2003, effective year built 1986. Effective year built, I'll give my layman terms of what I understand that to be. And you can maybe correct me or maybe add on to that. So effective year built usually is when there's a major permit done where they're doing kind of structural work. And usually, I know at least more recently, if it's going to be called an effective year built of 2020 or 2022, you have to do new electrical, new plumbing. It has to meet the current code in order to be that effective year built with the remodel. Now, how extensive that is, how much of the original home is there, that can vary, right? So what do you know about effective year built kind of above and beyond that?
Yeah. I mean, generally with effective year built, especially these days, the city is requiring a lot to be done.
Right.
And unfortunately, when they're requiring that much to be done, it's hard to maintain a lot of the character that existed within the house. Yeah. So, you know, effective year builts are great in that all those systems that you worry about in older homes have been updated, and you kind of have assurances of that. But sometimes you'll lose a little bit in that process. A lot of times in the core neighborhoods, people who are doing that size of renovation are pretty intentional about that, and they'll attempt to use products that are, as reminiscent of that period as possible, which is really great. The other thing you see sometimes, though, is people saying a gut renovation, but when you're living in a house and you're remodeling the kitchen, anything can feel like a gut renovation,
Yeah.
And just because you redid the kitchen doesn't mean that the wiring was updated everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful when things look shiny and new in the places you want them to look shiny and new. You still, with an older home, want to make sure that you're checking kind of all those systems and getting as much information as possible. Not that it would necessarily deter your decision to purchase an older home. You just want to go in with as much information as possible on what expenses might exist in the future for you.
Yeah, I would say a common example of that is I've seen a lot of homes where they'll list new electrical or new electrical in 2016 because the seller told the realtor that. And so maybe the seller had the kitchen and bathrooms remodeled. And at that time, the electrician comes in, puts a new panel in, or maybe doesn't put a new panel in, but just does like $10,000, $15,000 worth of electrical work to the kitchen and bathrooms and maybe grounds all of the outlets. Maybe it's a $30,000 electrical job. But then the inspection comes up and there's still knob and tube in the attic and they're saying, wait, what is this? And a lot of times it seems like those light switches, to fully take out all of that old knob and tube being probably, what is that, 1930s and older, 1920s and older is when they used knob and tube wires.
Right.
You'll have people that think their entire house has been rewired and that's not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And also sometimes it has all been rewired, but some of that knob and tube has not all been
That's true.
taken out of the home.
Yeah.
And it's hard for inspectors who, if they see any evidence of a knob or a tube, whether it's live or not, they have to bring that up just in case. So, then it's helpful to reach out to the seller and see, who did your electrical, make sure that permit. So that's a thing, seller said new electrical. Well, let's go check the permit office. You can go to track it in the permit office. You don't have to be a contractor. You can have a contractor login, but you can also have a public login. And you can go in and you can search the address and you can search what permits were pulled and were they finaled. That's the thing. You can pull a permit, but did an inspector come out and say, yep, all done. It looks good to go, sort of a thing. So that's a thing I like to double check too.
Cool. I agree. Agreed. So let's say you're a buyer, you're looking for a house right now. You like older homes. And obviously, if you are in this market, you could hire Jen as your realtor. But if you're in another market or you have another wonderful realtor that you don't want to lose, but you're online and you're trying to get a sense of, I don't want to even go out and look at a house that might be a lot of work or might have some issues. What are some of the red flags you might look for if you're just looking online, older home? You could talk about red flags or just kind of really obvious things about additions or older homes that you can just catch in pictures that maybe somebody who's not quite as with it is going to be able to notice right away.
Those are hard things to catch in pictures.
That's true. I guess a lot of it isn't in the pictures.
Yeah. But things that I look for, and I think my clients look for when you're looking at older homes online, are the things that really capture the characteristics of that home, right? That are hard to replicate. So those original materials, like those hardwood floors, like the casings and the moldings, right? We know the price of wood these days, and wood doesn't exist like it existed back then, right?
Yeah.
The tight grain of that wood, the strength of the wood, the size of the trim. If you were to recreate that these days, it would be almost impossible because those trees don't exist, but also very expensive, even if you were to use modern wood. So I like to see how much of those character pieces still exist within the home. because that's a good starting point, right? There's other things that you might want to upgrade, right? The kitchen was redone, in the 80s, like great, like let's give that another go around maybe, right? And you can do that and you can modernize while kind of still honoring that history of the home, right?
Yeah.
So doing a penny tile in a bathroom is always going to look classic, but you can do it, newer. Really, you get into more of those red flags when you get in person. So when you're online, I look for those, original characteristics, then also taking a look at that permit office and seeing, what's been done recently. Unfortunately, like I said, there's that really large information gap between the 1930s and the 1980s at least. Another thing you can do that I like to do when I'm buying older homes is go into the permit office and just say, hey, I'm looking at this home. They have microfilm there that can fill in some of that information gap from the 80s to the mid 90s that hasn't been uploaded yet into their systems. And so I like as much information as possible when I'm buying a home, right? So looking at those microfilms and seeing, sometimes permits were pulled in the 80s that you can get, again, more sense on timeline of things like that. Obviously, some of the things that you worry about with older homes is the materials that were used, right? That we now know are really harmful. So lead, asbestos, things like that, and the different locations that those exist, right? So sometimes if you're not planning to change those items, they're okay right where they are. You just need to be cognizant of them. Other things you want to make sure get changed out. So taking a look, at the siding. When you get into a home, usually basements are really fun. You can take a look at the underside of things. Do you see any asbestos wrapped pipes? What's the wood like? What's the electrical like? What do the pipes look like? So those are the things they're not going to show you pictures of online.
And a lot of times the floors aren't always level in older homes, and that's hard to tell sometimes in pictures. And then you get in the house and you're like, and that's just sometimes the nature of the way the foundation was built. Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that it's still not a great house.
Yeah.
And before we move on to anything else, you've talked about something that I didn't plan on asking you, but I am now curious.
Okay.
So we talk about like strong bones, good, the solid homes, solid character, all that kind of stuff. Realtors love terms like that. And I tend to be of the kind of thought process that newer homes, I have a bias towards newer homes, just honestly, where I kind of think, okay, the way that they put, it's less nails, it's more screws, it's insulated better, we know the wiring's better, all of those kind of things. It's more energy efficient, most newer homes. But you mentioned there being this value in truly some of those old materials, and not just from a character standpoint, but truly even the quality of the wood, the type of wood. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of these homes are still in great shape 100 years later.
Exactly.
So you do have the school of thought that sometimes an older home, in a lot of ways, if you take it and then you do the right renovations to it, can actually be a more solid home in some ways than a newer house.
Yeah. I mean, they're still standing today because they were built, with such great materials. Now, have we improved? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And are the ways that we can make improvements on older homes? Absolutely. But, generally there are new home people, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
And then there's people who want that character, and they're going to deal with a little bit higher, heating costs and things like that because they want that character of home. Right. And so if that's your track, like, let's do that in the best way possible for you, and you can keep your new home. Right.
That's true. Fair enough. Fair enough.
But there is a lot of value in some of those older materials and the craftsmanship, honestly, like the craftsmanship that existed back then that people were doing by hand is really beautiful. And I think having been a contractor, having worked on these homes with my own two hands and seen like how these things came together and how they made it work, it's just really incredible what people were able to do back then.
Sweet. So we're going to do a separate thing. We have a blog. Our company blog is Bellingham Real Estate Stories. It's kind of a vlog where we shoot videos of neighborhoods and things like that. And we occasionally do little stories. Yeah. And we're going to do a part 2 of this where we're going to go into a neighborhood, kind of talk about the history of the neighborhood and look at the history of a couple homes to give people an example of how you can go about doing this. The most we know, so the core neighborhoods, lettered streets, Columbia, Cornwall Park, York.
Yeah. And then obviously South Hill, Fairhaven. And then it's really interesting, actually. The city of Bellingham has a really interesting interactive map that tracks building from 1900 to 2020. And so you can kind of see what houses existed at 1900, 1910, 1920, and you can see the city grow. So yeah, generally those core neighborhoods, Columbia, even into Birchwood a little bit, lettered streets, Cornwall Park, York. And then obviously the larger homes along South Hill.
Maybe Sunnyland a little bit.
Sunnyland, yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And then even up along to Lake Whatcom. Obviously there's some older
Silver
homes.
Beach has some really
Lake
cool
Whatcom,
history. Yeah.
Because of the
train.
The train and the different industries that existed out there. So you'll find some out there as well.
And what was that map called again?
It's through the city of Bellingham housing statistics.
Okay.
So we can provide a link to that. But yeah, they have really cool, interesting statistics about older homes, but also just density of our different areas and things like that.
That is super cool to look at the pictures.
Yeah,
and see how things have changed.
I watch it multiple times and watch different areas and also you can see the infill too, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Columbia started, it was, a couple blocks or a couple homes per block, right? And then it infilled over time, and you can see, when buildings started going up Alabama, we know that most of those homes are that split level style, and you can see it kind of the development, grow in different areas and parts of the city.
Sweet. Yeah. No, that's very, very neat. And so thank you for all of that. And yeah, definitely everybody, we'll have Bellingham. We'll have some links for you, but then on just Google Bellingham Real Estate Stories, or on Instagram or Facebook, just search for Bellingham Real Estate Stories, and we'll do a part 2 of this where we'll go into a neighborhood and look at a couple homes, or look at least one home really thoroughly. But otherwise, if you have more questions, you can reach out to Jen. You clearly know your stuff. You're clearly into this. And so you can reach out to Jen direct. Thank you for jumping on, Jen. Yeah. We appreciate you. Thank you for listening or watching. And cheers.